Her palm rested already upon his fastening when the weathered farmer comprehended that the sister intended to remove his clothing. The sun above the meadow was merciless, keen as a knife, casting warmth upon the portico of his solitary wooden dwelling. Jacob Hale sat upon the step, boots firmly placed, jaw clenched, simply another arid afternoon among a lifetime filled with such days, until the young woman in the dark garment lowered herself to her knees between his legs. Her head covering was tilted, her cheeks glistened with perspiration and tears, and her fingers trembled as they grasped his belt. She looked upward at him, eyes clouded, pupils expanded, breath arriving in short, abrupt inhalations, the white fabric of her collar framing a face that belonged in a place of worship, not upon the floor of an elderly farmer's entrance. Her voice emerged rough. "Allow me to become Eve and sample what is prohibited." Jacob's mind emptied for a moment. No prayer, no regulation, no passage from sacred text, only the flow of warm blood that confirmed he remained a man and remained alive. He felt the pull at his fastening, the cool air upon skin untouched for years, and for the duration of one heartbeat he did not stir. He could have inclined forward. He could have allowed his hands to enter her hair, could have imagined this as some unusual offering from a harsh providence. His thighs tightened instead, every fiber urging consent, while every remembrance of his deceased wife and every address he had partially attended in the settlement urged refusal. Her fingers drew lower. She moved nearer, chest rising and falling, murmuring fragmented words that had once been invocations and were now entirely different. He observed the small wooden cross at her waist strike his knee as she shook. That ended the trance. Jacob seized her wrist. His hands were coarse, his hold nearly causing discomfort, and he pulled her fingers away from the open fastening, drawing the metal upward with a sharp sound. He rose to his feet so quickly she nearly fell to one side, the surroundings shifting as he inhaled a breath that carried the flavor of dust and regret. She was trembling, eyes filled with urgent desire and fear, grasping the front of his shirt now that she could not reach lower. He was unsteady as well, from the exertion, from the lingering effect of the choice he had nearly made here at the boundary of isolation. No clergyman would discover it, no officer would concern himself, and the divine presence seemed very remote. Consider this. If you had occupied Jacob Hale's position with a medicated sister upon her knees before you, requesting to sample what is prohibited, would you have possessed the resolve to remove her hands, or would you have surrendered to the intensity? Several hours before that portico moment, the sister still appeared as a woman who believed the world could be repaired with bread and prayer. The sun stood directly overhead when Sister Isabella entered the small frontier village. Maintain it orderly, ensure smooth delivery, a basket of firm bread upon her arm. She proceeded from door to door, distributing portions to children with dripping noses, to elderly men who carried the scent of earth and tobacco. One man who did not was Harlan Voss, the individual who declared himself a physician because no one had intervened to prevent it. He distributed restorative liquids from a tilted small store, dark containers arranged where all could view them, the type of preparation that caused men to smile and women to fade from sight. Isabella had advised two women from the tavern not to consume his attractive red liquid. She had stated it was harmful to the spirit, and possibly to the body as well. The information returned to Harlan, and it is reasonable to assume he did not accept it favorably. Therefore, when she entered his establishment on that intense day, merely to purchase a remedy for a child's cough, he smiled more broadly than usual. While he spoke, his fingers moved rapidly behind the counter. He poured her a glass of water, entirely courteous. He said, "You appear pale, sister. You should drink. The desert sun is no trivial matter." She paused for one heartbeat, then accepted it. Individuals of faith often assume the most positive intentions, even when caution suggests otherwise. She paid for the remedy, offered thanks using his name, and walked back into that intensely bright street. Halfway to the convent, the world shifted. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The cloth around her neck felt like a cord. Perspiration descended her back far more than the heat justified. By the time she arrived at the edge of the village, she had loosened the head covering, fingers scratching at the heavy dark fabric. The path divided. One route led to the convent, toward regulations and disgrace. The other led outward to a solitary farm and a man she knew only slightly but trusted more than anyone in the village. She directed herself toward the farm without consideration, and that is how a medicated sister arrived before Jacob Hale's door, partially unclothed under the midday sun, with a stranger's toxin surging through her veins. Because the moment she passed through that door, temptation and compassion occupied the same portico, and only one of them would depart unchanged. When Isabella finally reached Jacob Hale's portico, she did not knock like a reserved sister from the convent. She struck the door with the side of her fist, 3 firm impacts that shook the frame. Jacob was in his chair, partially asleep with his hat covering his eyes. The noise awakened him abruptly. He opened the door expecting a farm laborer or an intoxicated person. Not a young sister swaying upon her feet, with her head covering hanging loose and her eyes excessively bright, her cheeks flushed and her lips parted, perspiration darkening the fabric at her throat. The neat dark garment was askew now, the top buttons of her collar undone, a pale strip of skin visible where no one was intended to see. "Please," she said, seizing his shirt with both hands. "Something is amiss. I cannot reduce the heat." He considered sunstroke first, but her pulse raced faster than any case of heat exhaustion he had observed. Her pupils were widely dilated. Her breath came in sharp, sharp bursts, and there was that odor upon her, faint and sweet beneath the perspiration and dust. Jacob had encountered that sweetness previously on men staggering from Harlan Boss's rear room. He stepped aside and guided her inside, one large hand under her elbow. Not an appropriate place to bring a woman in this condition, but he had no other option. She stumbled to the chair by the table, and then nearly fell from it. Her fingers scratched at the front of her dress, pulling the fabric away from her skin. "It burns," she whispered. "Inside. I prayed. It worsened." She pulled the white cloth from her head, hair falling loose around her shoulders. Her hands moved to the rope belt at her waist, struggling to untie it. Jacob moved swiftly for an older man. He captured her wrists, pressed them downward, retrieved a worn blanket from the bed, and wrapped it around her like a barrier.
"Stop," he said. "You are not yourself, sister." She resisted him nonetheless. For a moment, it was not a holy woman and an aging farmer. It was simply a man and a woman in a small, warm room. Her body pressed against his, her breath upon his neck, the blanket slipping. "God is not present," she said, words trembling. "You are. Assist me, please." He could feel every outline of her through the fabric, and he disliked himself for noticing. He held her more firmly, attempting to keep the blanket closed, attempting to position his hands correctly. That was when she twisted, stronger than he anticipated, and pulled him with her toward the open door, toward the light. In the following heartbeat, they were on the portico, as you have seen what her desperate hands attempted to do to him there. And now that you understand she was poisoned before she ever touched that fastening, the genuine question is this: whom do you hold more responsible? The young woman whose mind was aflame, or the man who distributed that sweet small bottle that transformed a sister into a moving enticement? If this type of narrative affects you deeply, you may select subscribe so you do not miss what occurs next on this isolated farm. Obtain a cup of coffee or tea, position yourself comfortably, and inform me in the comments what time it is in your location and from which part of the world you are listening at present. For a moment after he pulled her hands away, Jacob simply stood there, chest rising and falling, gazing at the woman on her knees as if he had never observed another person in his life. The fastening was returned to its proper place. His belt was askew, his hands still shaking. Isabella was enveloped in his old blanket, breathing as if she had traveled 10 miles, eyes wild and moist. Jacob retreated until his shoulders met the portico post. "Remain in place," he muttered. "Do not move, sister." She did not obey. The drug still surged through her. She rose to her feet, blanket slipping from one shoulder, fingers reaching for him again. Jacob turned away so quickly his neck made a sound. He walked down the steps, took the iron bucket by the trough, and filled it with cold well water. He carried the first bucket back up and poured the cold water over her ankles and wrists. She recoiled as if struck, then leaned toward the cold as if her skin could not decide its preference. One bucket was insufficient, so he returned to the well, filled another, then another. Before long there were 4 empty buckets on the portico, and his shirt clung to his back with perspiration and well water. When her teeth began to chatter at last, he retrieved an old washing tub that he used for cleaning saddle blankets. He filled it as high as his injured shoulder allowed, carried it to the shade beside the house, and managed to place her into it, blanket included. He tied the ends of the blanket together in front, awkwardly but securely. Then he looped a soft rope from the portico post around her wrist and the rail, loose enough to allow blood flow, tight enough that she could not grasp him if the fever returned. "This is not to humiliate you," he said. "It is so you cannot harm yourself or me while that poison affects you." For a time it appeared effective. She leaned against the post, lips forming words that might have been prayers. Then, as the heat inside her reignited, she struggled against the rope, pleaded for touch, for warmth, for anything to calm the turmoil in her blood. Jacob had to retie the knots twice when she freed a hand. He pulled the tub closer, more water over her neck and hair, spoke to her in the same low voice he used with nervous young horses hour after hour. By the time the stars appeared, her strength had faded. She hung in the rope like damp fabric, head tilted forward, breath slow but regular. By the gray margin of dawn, she was no longer resisting. She was simply breathing, light and shallow. Jacob untied her wrists, lifted her out of the tub with arms that felt as if carved from stone, and carried her inside as if she weighed nothing. She did not rise in the morning light. She could not. When Jacob awakened on the floor beside the bed, every joint aching, she remained there on the mattress, wrapped in his old blanket, eyes half open but too weak to sit up. "You are not walking anywhere today," he said. "But we cannot leave this unresolved. That could have ended it, if Jacob had chosen to ignore it and allow the poison to remain secret." By mid-morning he had the wagon prepared. He placed a pile of old quilts in the back, lifted her in as gently as his stiff back permitted, and tucked the blanket closely around her shoulders. She attempted to object once, but the motion of the road soon lulled her into a hazy half-sleep while the horses drew them toward the village. When they arrived in the village, Jacob secured the horses outside Harlan Voss's shop and assisted Isabella down from the wagon. Her legs could not support her far, so he partially walked and partially supported her as they entered through the doorway. Isabella placed the stained blanket on the counter with hands that still trembled, then set down the small cracked bottle Jacob had found under her chair. "This is what you sold me," she said. "It turned a house of prayer into a trap. It turned me into temptation on an old man's portico." "Come now, Sheriff," he said. "Are you going to believe some sister who cannot manage her holy water? Perhaps she desired some amusement and then changed her mind." The other one grinned at Isabella. "It appears to me that the old farmer finally became lonely enough." Jacob crossed the room before his mind could follow his boot. His fist met the drunkard's mouth with a sound like a shovel striking wet earth. The man fell backwards, chair and all, and the laughter ceased immediately. "That is sufficient, Hale," the sheriff declared. "You do not have the right to strike people in my village just because a woman makes an accusation." "A poisoned woman," Jacob replied. He picked up the small bottle from the counter and removed the cork with his thumb. That same sickly sweet smell that had clung to Isabella spread into the warm air of the shop. "You have smelled this on men leaving here before, Sheriff. You simply did not wish to understand why."
For a moment, the room held its breath. Then an older woman near the door stepped forward. "My husband drank that," she said quietly. "He was not himself for 3 days. He came home speaking to shadows and grasping at me as if I were someone else." Another woman nodded. "Mine as well. Same bottle, same smell." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He looked at Isabella, at the faint marks on her wrist, at the blanket with its stains. Then he turned to Harlan. "Do you have anything to say before I confine you?" Harlan opened his mouth, but whatever he intended to say ended there. The sheriff fastened the irons on his wrists while half the village watched. In a place like that, men who sold poison did not receive many additional opportunities. As the sheriff led Harlan out into the street, Jacob stepped onto the boardwalk and watched him leave. He spat in the dust, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and said, almost to himself, "Some men sell poison. True men provide the remedy, even when it nearly destroys them." "They will speak," she said, "about me, about you." "Let 'em," he replied. "We know what occurred and what did not on these steps." For a long time they simply sat there listening to the crickets begin and the boards creak under their boots. Then, very softly, she asked, "Did we do anything I should confess?" He could have deceived her. He could have said no and ended it there. But an old man on the plain receives only so many chances to speak the truth. "You attempted," he said softly. "The drug did. Your hands reached as far as my fastening. I stood there like a fool and nearly allowed it, but nothing more than that. I pulled away. I tied you so you could not harm yourself or me. Then I sat right there and listened to you struggle against that evil until the sky turned dark." Her shoulders relaxed with a peculiar combination of shame and relief. "So I sinned in my heart," he added, voice rough, "but I did not sin with my body. I believe God understands the distinction." She moved closer, placing a hand on his arm. "You prevented me from falling when I was already beyond the edge. That is more than any man has ever done for me. Here is the part I hope remains with you. Jacob Hale was not a saint. Isabella was not composed of stone. They were two imperfect individuals who had every reason to yield and yet discovered a way to choose compassion over desire in a world full of Harlans. That is what matters. So allow me to ask you, friend, what do you derive from their night on that portico? Is it a caution regarding temptation, a lesson about substances, or a reminder that one sincere choice can alter the entire narrative of your life? If this story provided something to consider, select like so more people can discover it. Select subscribe if you wish to hear more accounts from the Old West that contain a small truth beneath the dust. Pour yourself a fresh cup of coffee or tea, position yourself comfortably, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you are right now and from which part of the world you are listening.